Uh, Good afternoon. I'm Tom Herman. I'm here with Tom Brokaw. It is November 15th, 2018, and we are here to record an oral history of television in New York. It's part of the Interviews Oral History of Television. And we're here in New York City and looking forward to speaking to Tom and exploring how he has become such an icon of television in this generation and for generations to come. Okay.
I'm good with all of that. Right? Just
All
we'll start
right.
as soon as you're ready. Just roll it. Get comfortable.
And Tom, what I'd like to do is just keep this informal. I'd like
Yeah.
to do a conversation. I am under strict instructions from my boss, Jenny, that we have to start with certain questions. So really the first question will be, I know this sounds like a dossier or almost a police question, but just if you could start with giving us your full name, where you were born, when, and that's an opening slate.
Okay. I'm a child of the prairie. I grew up in South Dakota. Both sides of my family had gone there as early settlers in northwestern South Dakota. On my dad's side, they opened a little railroading hotel. It was hard labor. My father dropped out of school in the third grade and was taken in by a Swedish homesteader and was taught to do the skills that gave him a way to make a living for the rest of his life. He began by driving a team of horses, then he converted to Caterpillar tractors and big, heavy equipment. My mother lived south of town on a farm with a kind of poetic Irish father who had a college education but wanted to be a farmer, picked the wrong time. They got caught in the Depression, downdraft. And my mother graduated from high school at 16, very attractive, really bright, wanted to be a journalist. And it cost $100 a year to go to college, so there was no way. My father courted her. It was the most unlikely courtship you can imagine. Here was my mother from this bookish family. My dad was red-haired, muscular guy, but he had a side about him that other people had not seen before. And when he saw mother, he knew that that's how he wanted to live his life, with her. And I often asked her, what was it about him that when he came to your door and asked you to go to the movies? She said, you know, it was intriguing. He was the politest guy I'd ever met. He came from this very rough background. He always had a little money, and he treated me extremely well. And my father was impressed by that. They courted for 4 or 5 years, and it was not until the 4th year that they were ever in a car together alone, because everybody had to go places by filling up the car. You know, 2 or 3 couples at a time. It was the Depression. And they got married, and they pursued what was for them the American dream. They were going to save $1,000 a year. My father was racing all over the Midwest, Kansas and Minnesota and North Dakota, building facilities, getting ready for World War II. Air bases and ammunition depots, that kind of thing. And the war hit, and we moved to a place called Igloo, South Dakota, which was the end of the earth. It was in southwestern South Dakota. It's where they stored ammunition and ordnance. It was filled with rattlesnakes and coyotes and sagebrush. My dad almost turned around and drove away when he came over through the gate because it was so forlorn. For me, it was the most exciting thing in the world because it was all going on around me. And my father wanted to be a CB. He went off to Denver, and the base commander called him back, said, this place doesn't operate unless you're here. He fixed cars, he plowed roads. He could make something out of nothing. So we had him at home in a cabin, in effect, with my mother with 3 boys, coal stove in the middle of the living room. And I think the square footage was 225 square feet. Imagine that. But it was, you know, I was 3 and 4 years old. I wore a helmet every day because I was fighting the Germans in the ditches and doing all that. And all around me, people were going to war, coming home from war. My high school hero, I was not yet in school, but the kid who lived across the street, he was a good athlete in high school. I still have this fixed memory of him. The day he graduated, he was in a Navy uniform going off to war. That's the life that we had there. And then the war came to an end, and we moved to central South Dakota to a huge project of building a dam, a flood control dam, in the middle of an Indian reservation. The soil had never been broken before. It was true Lewis and Clark country. And within 2.5 years, the government had built a town for 3,000 employees. And we had curb and gutter streets. We had a recreation center, a unbelievably postmodern high school, shopping center, a big movie theater, hospital, hotel, and then an assortment of housing. We lived in a duplex. We were on one half of a house. We had 3 bedrooms and hardwood floors, and my mother had never had a kitchen like that before. And everybody was making good money because it was paying good wages. And these were people who had come out of the Depression, gone through the war, and now here they were. My father bought his first new car, a bare-bones Chevrolet. I remember the price. It was $1,570. And it didn't have a radio or anything else, but we were over the moon about it. And my friends, my age, were growing up. I have a friend I was very close to, and he later said, you know, first time I ever had indoor plumbing. I said, you're kidding. He said, no. He lived in a trailer house. They had plumbing in the trailer house. He said, before that, I lived in hard job farms where we didn't have indoor plumbing.
Was this in Yankton?
Pardon me?
Was this in Yankton?
No, this was in a place called Fort Randall, Pickstown, biggest dam of its kind in the world at the time. Huge project, 24/7. And people were skilled welders and truck drivers and engineers, and it was for an impressionable kid that I was, an astonishing. It went on. You go down at night, and they would be working at these huge Euclid trucks that would be filled with dirt that they were moving from one place to another. My grandfather would direct them to where they would have to go. And everybody brought a different skill set to that project. And sometimes they were there for 2 or 3 years. Sometimes the job only lasted 6 months. So you made friends in a hurry. And they came from Oklahoma and Mississippi and from Minnesota and the Dakotas, obviously. And it was, for me, a very exciting time. And I'm still in touch with some of those people that I knew then.
Where were you born, on what date, and what was your full name? What is your full name?
I was born on February 6th, my grandfather's birthday, and it turns out Ronald Reagan's birthday and Babe Ruth's birthday, in Webster, South Dakota, in the middle of a snowstorm. Webster was a small county seat in the northern part of the state, 12 miles from where my dad's family had a little railroading hotel. And I've seen the pictures from then. They would put me in a snowsuit, put me out there, and it was like a comedy. I'd topple over in the snowsuit and couldn't get up again because it was heavy wool and you're in the middle of everything. And what I remember about the culture is that everybody helped everybody else. Whatever they were doing. They put up barns, and they built houses, and they moved houses. Everybody worked very, very hard, and I became the kind of community child. I was Red Brokaw and Jean Brokaw's son, firstborn, and my dad had 3 sisters who ran the hotel and 2 brothers who were there. You were raised by the community, and what I remember is that in the hotel where we lived one winter, just in a room, that downstairs they had these old horsehair stuffed sofas and chairs and philodendrons in the lobby. They had the display room where the traveling salesmen would show their goods, and these Norwegian and Swedish bachelors would stay there in the wintertime, and they would saucer their coffee. They would pour the coffee into the saucer to cool it and then slurp it through their mustache. And I was their pride and joy. I was buzzing around the lobby, chatting up everybody and everything. And I just have the fondest memories of these tough old Scandinavians who would, Tommy, they'd come over here, and they'd have a piece of gum for me or something. So I was really on the cusp between the 19th century and the 21st century by living in that environment. I look back on it, it was pretty damn old-fashioned, I must say, but I loved it.
Now, at some point, you your family moved from Pickstown to Yankton. Can
Right.
you recall that time in your life?
I recall it very well. When we were in Pickstown, everybody, when the dam was coming to a close, obviously all the government workers were going to be transferred somewhere. And I was very familiar with Yankton. It was 45 miles away. And it had two colleges, and it had a big basketball arena where we play the regional tournaments. It had a great main street, and it had a real reputation as having a very, very good public school system. And I knew two or three people from it because I was active in Boy Scouts, and we did things together. And my summer before we moved there, my roommate from Yankton in the tent that we shared had a picture of his girlfriend in his trombone case. He'd practice trombone every night, take a picture out and look at her. And I got to kind of know who she was. And then at the end of the summer, she wrote him a kind of a Dear John. She was quite a bit younger than he was. And so between the two of us, we wrote this withering response to her. And I've been married to her for 56 years. So when I moved to Yankton, I knew the roommate, and I knew the girl in the trombone case.
And the name of the girl?
Meredith Hall. Her dad, they were kind of the first family of Yankton. Her father was a physician. Her mother built a library. There were 5 children. They were all outstanding, with good athletes and handsome. And Meredith was the oldest of the girls, and she was a real straight arrow. She was a captain of the cheerleaders, and the two of us were very active in student politics. I was president of the student body. She was vice president. She was a cheerleader. I was a jock. We had the leads in the play, something called Boy State and Girl State. She was in Girls Nation. I was governor of Boy State. And we were great friends, but we never dated all the time we were in high school. I actually fixed her up with a good friend of mine who'd moved there from Pickstown as well. So, we stayed like that. And then she went to a small girls' college and came back. She'd gotten rid of her kind of Marion the librarian eyeglasses. She had contact lenses. She was always very beautiful, and she showed up the same bar that we were all going to. That was unheard of. Meredith just didn't go to bars, but there she was. And I've always said that was the turning point.
So, sounds like she captured your heart right away. Did the same thing happen on her side of the heart?
No, not at all. I was on a tear. I dropped out of the university. I finished a year at Iowa, went back to South Dakota, dropped out of there, wandering around the Midwest. I could always get a job in a radio station, but I was unfocused. And my parents were very upset. I was the first member of the family to go to college. I had all the hopes for them. And my friends, same thing. I mean, I ran with the smartest people on the campus. But there I was, working at a radio station in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and bouncing around. And my mother, who worked in a shoe store, said to Meredith one day, "What do you think's going on with Tom?" And she said, "I don't know, Mrs. Brokaw. I just don't think about it a lot." She was fed up with me. And she later told me that she was so upset that I'd hurt my mother's feelings that she wrote me this withering letter, Meredith did, saying, "We don't understand what's going on with you. I don't want to see you again. We all have better things to do than just wandering around." And it was a wake-up call, so it changed me. And as a result of that letter, I went back to school, worked full-time, got good grades, and Meredith came to me one day and said, I went too far. I said, no, I had it coming. And within a year, we were engaged and getting married.
Let's talk about high school for a minute. And maybe if I recall, this might have been one of your first or perhaps your first broadcasting jobs at KYNT Radio in Yankton, when you were asked to introduce the new wave of music, rock and roll. Could you tell us that story, please?
Well, I don't know quite why they hired me. I arrived in Yankton in the late summer of 1955. I was the new kid in town. But I did have a certain facility for talking and doing things. And right away, the radio station people came to me and said, "We're going to do a teenage rock and roll show. We want you to do it." Man, that was a big deal. And my girlfriend at the time was Mary Lee Keating, a saucy Irish girl who went to the Catholic school. So we did this 1 hour. And, we introduced Yankton to Fats Domino and the Coasters and a lot of Elvis, obviously, and Jerry Lee Lewis for 1 hour every night. And I was sufficiently good at it. The radio station kind of hired me. I worked nights when they didn't have somebody who could fill in from 10 to midnight. I was talking the other day about my first election. That fall was Eisenhower running for re-election, and I was out chasing down the returns in the local precincts and going on the air with them. And I think that was the beginning of my passion, that I loved doing it. I was a political junkie, and I thought, people get the returns right now. They hear it on radio, and I can still see the radio studio with Bill Johnson hunched over the microphone reading these returns, and they brought in food from Kip's Blue Moon Drive-In. It was it was roasted chicken. I thought, man, you get free food and you get to go on radio. What more can you ask?
So you did have other career ambitions as a youth. You thought about being a politician or a lawyer, but ultimately you chose journalism. How did that overcome?
Well, I was very active in student politics as well as being a pretty good athlete. I was a starter on the basketball team, and I was a pole vaulter and track, and I was a backup quarterback on a really good football team. But I was always interested in politics and the social environment. And in South Dakota, there were no models for what I ended up doing, frankly. I liked politics. I paid attention to what was going on in our state. I got very close to the governor of South Dakota, who was a big Marine hero from World War II, knew George McGovern when he first got started. And so I thought, become a lawyer, get involved in politics. Lawyer is a good profession. And my parents had that in mind, I think, when I started out. My dad, who, as I said, was a genius at everything mechanical and carpentering and everything, knew that I wasn't going to make a living doing that. It's not what I liked doing. I would go on and help him. I knew all the tools and everything, but at the end of the day, I don't want to do this, So I thought I'd be a lawyer, and I think a lot of people in South Dakota thought I'd stay in politics. I was so active in student politics. But then because I had opportunities in radio first, and then when I was should have been a junior in college, I went to work at a television station in Sioux City, Iowa for $75 a week as a booth announcer. I did the weekend weather and a lot of all this stuff. And television nationally was beginning to rise. Huntley and Brinkley were coming on the air. And I liked it. And I worked with a terrific guy who'd come out there to get his career started. He was a graduate of Northwestern. His name was David Shoemaker. He later became a CBS correspondent. And he kind of counseled me, you can do this, I'll help, and so I thought, maybe this is what I'd like to do. And the defining moment for me was election night. In 1960, I stayed up until 8 o'clock in the morning watching Huntley and Brinkley, that great race between Nixon and Kennedy, and seeing all these very impressive guys, John Chancellor, Sander Van Oker, Frank McGee, on the air, and the camaraderie that existed in the studios talking about where the country was going. Man, what more could you ask than to be a part of that?
Let's talk for a moment about your early TV influences. I understand that watching that old Zenith TV at home in South Dakota, you would see Dave Garroway, Chet Huntley, David Brinkley, and others. How did that influence your career?
Well, one of the things I remember vividly, my mother was a great student of politics. First political awareness I had, she woke me up when I was 8 years old and said, "We won." It was Truman beating Dewey. And she talked about Alvin Barkley's son waking him up that day and say, grandson say, "Daddy, we won." I was 8 years old at the time. So when you now get to South Dakota, to Yankton, where for the first time we had television. We didn't have it before then. And I was in the wilderness wandering around, and Mother was watching faithfully the Today Show every morning. And they had a guy who did the morning cut-ins. His name was Irv Glanz, and his style kind of reflected his name. He was not very good, quite honestly. My mother watched him one morning and said, you're better than that. Why don't you get on the bus, go to Sioux City, and see if you can get a job at that television station? And that's what I did.
And this was KTIV TV?
KTIV, yeah.
You went, and that was, you went from KTIV to KMTV in Omaha?
I did.
And when was that, and can you recall
How did that happen?
came? Yeah.
Well, it was a guy from Miami had seen me in the summertime working on television and thought that I had what it took. And so he said, I've got a job for you down here. Unfortunately, I was working in the Black Hills at the time. He talked to my boss, and I was kind of a hellraiser, and my boss said, I don't think you want to go there. So he pulled the job offer. And Meredith and I were getting married, thinking we were going to Miami, and then it fell out. And there was a kind of paterfamilias at South Dakota by the name of Bill Farber. He'd been the political science head forever. And we were all known as Farber's boys. And I was a kind of mission because I came there with high expectations. And as I say, I fell off the rails and then I got back on again. And so Bill said to me one day, how's it work? I said, I don't have a job. We're getting married in August. I think there may be a job in Omaha. He said, get in the car, we're going to Omaha. I literally said it just like that. And I got in the car, we drove to Omaha. I made a cold call on the news director. He took me to lunch at a Greasy Spoon. And an hour and a half later, he said, I've never had anybody work for me who knows as much about politics as you do or is engaged. You know, most of they were great reporters there, but they were guys who followed the fire trucks and did the police reporting and that kind of thing. I love the political part. So Mark Gautier hired me. And he said, I'll pay you $90 a week. And I said, I have to have $100. He said, you begged for a job, now you're asking for a raise. I said, I am marrying the daughter of a doctor. And if I don't have $100 a week, you know, he'll say, what's this all about? He said, okay, I'll give you $100 a week. You'll never get a raise. And he kept his word, by the way.
While you were at KMTV in Omaha in the early 60s, a couple of watershed moments in television journalism, in young television journalism, occurred. The first half-hour nightly news broadcast on CBS, and of course, the assassination of President Kennedy. Could you talk about your memories of that and how those may have influenced
Well, I was
you?
doing pretty well there. It was a very conservative station. They used to say, you know, if you stay with us another 5 or 6 years, you may get to do the 6 o'clock news. They had a guy who was an announcer, effectively, doing the news, Tom Henry. And he didn't care about the news. He was just an announcer. And I cared about the news. And I remember that the bureau chief for NBC in Chicago came out to our station to say, we're going to a half an hour. We don't know whether we can fill it. And our station had a reputation of being a reliable partner of the network because Floyd Calver had started there. Floyd Calver became the anchorman in Chicago for years. And he'd been on Huntley Brinkley a lot. So they came to our station saying, we may need your help. And I thought that was pretty exciting. It turns out he went back to New York and said, that man did, and he said, there's a young guy out there we probably ought to hire. And in the meantime, something else happened. But there I was in Omaha. I was on Huntley Brinkley 2 or 3 times from Omaha on stories. Very exciting. But I was spinning my wheels in Omaha. I wasn't, you know, I was working 6 days a week, and I wasn't making much more money, and the station was so conservative. And out of nowhere, I got a call from the hottest NBC affiliate in the country, which was WSB in Atlanta, Georgia. And about the time that happened, I was working in the newsroom one day, and the bell started going off with the UPI machine. I went over casually. Shots had been fired at the presidential motorcade in Dallas. And in those days, NBC, the network, went dark and gave local programming, and we had a woman's show on the air. So I grabbed the wire service, and it said, I'll always remember Meredith Smith saying, Secret Service agents unlimbered their automatic rifles, but it was too late, the damage had been done. And I ran down and I said, I need to go on the air right now over the women's show. So I said, shots were fired at the president today in a motorcade in Dallas. He was hit, he may have been killed, and then as soon as we got confirmation, I went back down and did that again. And then when the hour ended, then the network took over, and we were scrambling. There was a Midwestern Governors Conference going on in Omaha, led by Mitt Romney, the father of, and he was the governor of Michigan. It was a pretty distinguished group of governors, and we all ran down there to get his reaction to it. I actually shared it with his son, and it was George Romney who was Mitt Romney came later. It was the son. George Romney was the governor of Michigan, and I later told his son Mitt about how impressed we all were with his dad, who came out very distinguished and talked about what a grievous day it was for the country. And my cameraman lowered his camera and said to him at the end, "Governor, I don't know what to say. I'm just so sorry." And Governor Romney went over and put his arm around him and said, "Son, we're all sorry." It made a big impression on me about where we were in the country, about this is a national tragedy. So we're on the air a lot. And what I really remember, Nebraska was very conservative. They were not Kennedy people. And they were really proud of their football team. And they were scheduled to play Oklahoma on Saturday for the Big 8 title. Everything was being canceled in America. Nebraska would not cancel the game. And I went down to cover that. And Bud Wilkinson, who was the coach at Oklahoma, I don't think he looked up the entire time. I watched him on the sideline. He just walked with his head down. Nebraska won the game. Stands went crazy. It was so inappropriate. It was so inappropriate. And Sunday, Meredith and I were in church, and the Episcopal priest gave the appropriate kind of sermon, went back, and then came back running out and said, "Oh my God, Jack Ruby has been killed." So I went back down to the station, but it was the network was doing most of the stuff at that point.
There were local cut-ins?
Not really. They didn't come to us for anything. We fed them the governor's conference and some other things, but it was a network story, and Nebraska wasn't connected to it. But what I do remember vividly at that point, I'd born in 1940, graduated from college in 1960, should have graduated in 62, graduated in 64. My life had just been on an upward trajectory. Everything had been going well, and the country was so excited. People that I knew, not all of them obviously, about Jack Kennedy and youthful vigor, and it was a new generation taking hold. Civil rights movement was beginning. And then they shot the president. Oh my God, that doesn't happen in America. This doesn't happen. I remember vividly, I was driving out to Strategic Air Command headquarters to see what kind of a lockdown they were on. And all the way out there, I was talking to myself, my God, this doesn't happen. This is a terrible tragedy. And it was an introduction to the life that I subsequently had of, these upheavals in our culture and our history and where we are in the world.
In 1965, I believe, you mentioned that you and Meredith moved to Atlanta and you began working for WSB TV for a time. Could you talk about that and also talk about the state of the civil rights movement in the South at that time?
Well, that was a huge break for us. I got a call from Ray Moore in Atlanta. It was probably the best NBC affiliate in the country in those days. It was in the middle of the civil rights movement. Atlanta was a dynamic city. They had wonderful correspondents and reporters who worked there. And Dr. King would come back to Atlanta, and the stuff was going on all around him. And Ray Moore called me at home one night, and I thought he was putting me on. I thought it was somebody faking Ray Moore's name, because we all knew about that station. I was 25 years old. I was a white kid from South Dakota, and he's offering me the 11 o'clock news in Atlanta. I mean, it was unheard of, quite honestly. And he said, could you come down and spend the weekend with us? We'd like to get to know you. And I said, I can't if I can leave on Friday night, because if my station finds out about it, they'll fire me. I mean, they would have if they thought I was looking for another job. So I flew down. I had a broken foot from playing basketball. I played in a YMCA league. Meredith said, they're never going to hire you. They're going to think you're a risk. So I hobbled across O'Hare and got to Atlanta. Magnolias were in bloom. It was an early, warm day, and the cab driver said, the station was called White Columns on Peachtree. And he said, White Columns on Peachtree. Yes, sir. It's part of the pride of the South. I thought, I want to move here. If they don't give me this job, I'm going to kill myself. And so I went to the station and had a great dinner with the news director. And then by chance, the next day, Churchill had just died. And the man who ran Cox Broadcasting was Leonard Wrench, who was a Truman aide. He was well known for his place in National. He'd been the media advisor to Jack Kennedy for the '60 convention. And Leonard Wrench came into the station. He had all these pictures of Truman with Churchill, and he was in the pictures as well. I was a Churchill junkie even then, and as kind of a good history student. I said, "So were you on the train to Westminster when he gave the great speech?" And he said, "Yes." How did you? I said, "Well, I read about that. Tell me about the poker game." And he said, "How do you know?" I said, "Well, I know you played poker on the way out and the way back." And he said, "Here's what we had to do." He said, "Churchill was not a good poker player." So old Harry said, "Let him win a few." That was a great story. And I was very engaged in it. I actually think I got the job because Leonard Wrench walked out and said, "Hire him." So they said, we got the 11 o'clock news, tripled my salary from Omaha. They gave me full complement of family health benefits, welfare benefits. We didn't have that in Omaha. And I flew back to Omaha, and I was delayed by a storm, so I got in late, and there was a big station event, and all my bosses were lined up. "Where have you been?" And I said, "I've been to Atlanta." They said, "Atlanta?" I said, "Yes," and I've been hired to do the 11 o'clock news, and they almost fainted, and I'm going. I've loved being here. One of them, who I didn't ever get along with, said, "Brokaw, it's a fast track. You're going to fall off. You shouldn't be leaving here." I said, "I'll take a chance." So Meredith and I packed up our belongings and put them in a two-wheel trailer and drove to Atlanta, Georgia. And it was a transformational moment for me because it was all hell breaking loose in the South. And I would, at the end of the 11 o'clock news, I would get on a charter and fly down to Alabama to Haneyville. They'd killed a civil rights worker from the north in Haneyville. I'd go to Americus, Georgia, where they had a really nasty confrontation. And one day, the most dangerous thing for me was little noted because we'd heard that a county called Tolliver County had integrated its school system under court order, but white supremacists said, "We're going to create a separate bus system to take kids from here and send them to the next county to school." So I took a cameraman, went by myself, with an AP photographer over there. School bus shows up, filled with white kids, and out of the houses in the black neighborhoods, parents sent their black children to get on the bus. And out of the woods came rednecks. I mean, really, they were lumberjacks, and they were mean. They started throwing these black kids off the bus and beating on them. And then they realized I was there with my camera crew. And they grabbed the camera from my cameraman, who was a Southern guy. He didn't ever think like this would ever happen. And they were closing in on me. And I was trying to stay very cool, but I knew I was about to get the hell beaten out of me, quite honestly, when a highway patrol captain from Atlanta showed up, and he had seen me on the air a lot. I'd covered other stories where he was around. And he looked at me, and he kind of, hard looking. He said, "Boys, I don't blame you. I know what you want to do. You do that, we're going to have a hell of a lot of trouble here. We're going to let Mr. Brokaw leave right now. Right, Mr. Brokaw?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And the sheriff had a 12 gauge pointed at me. He said, "You got about 2 minutes, young man, to get the hell out of this town." Well, I went back and I did a radio report, and we took the film and put it on the air. And the next day, typically, correspondents from all over the country were in Tolliver County, and it was all hell to pay for it. But it was, and I went on the air. My boss was so good in Atlanta when I got back, he said, "I want you to go on the air tonight, first person, and tell the people of Atlanta what it's like to be caught in a situation like that." And I remember the bare bones of what I said, which was that if in Atlanta we think this doesn't affect us, or that you can feel secure in your homes because you're not a part of that, the rest of the country seeing this is making everybody in the South guilty because they are. They're not speaking out. I was a white kid from the North saying this. We had a telephone, I mean, the switchboard rang off the hook saying, thank God somebody said that, you know, and I have to think again about what we're doing down here. So it was a kind of a defining moment for me. And it was that story and one other that caught the attention of NBC. And by August, I'd gotten there in March. By August, NBC came and said we wanted to come to work for us.
What was the other story that caught the attention of the network?
There's a place called Americus, Georgia. And Americus was a hotbed. It was a southern mill town. And a white kid had been killed by some black demonstrators who'd gotten out of control, and he was killed, and the town went up, as you might expect, really went up. It was also the state senate district of Jimmy Carter, the first time we kind of knew who he was. And it was touch and go. I mean, the Klan was there, and I was on the air 24/7 with stuff. At one point, the Klan was going to throw me in the trunk of a car, and Lester Maddox, of all people, who had the restaurant in Atlanta, said, "Oh, I know who he is. He does it. No, would leave him alone." And so they left me alone. And then I was on the air kind of a lot. So those two stories got the attention of NBC.
So this is now 1966, and NBC wants you
It's still 65. I waited until our first child was born. Then I went in 66 to California.
And talk about that. NBC West Coast, KNBC.
I turned them down the first time. I wanted to go to Washington. I went out. They brought me out to take a look at it. It was August. It was smoggy. It was hot, and California was not my thing, frankly. And I drove around, and I finally went down to the beach one night by myself and found a little kind of bar with a pool table. I was a pretty good pool player, so I played some pool with the locals and drank a few beers and went back. Well, maybe we can do this. But I went back and said to WSB, I want to stay here. I like the Cox Broadcasting Company. Thinking down the road I want to go to Washington. NBC thought I was negotiating. So they bumped it up. They gave me more money than I'd ever thought possible. I went from $16,000 to $25,000 a year. In my family, that was unheard of. And they released a car for me. They said, you do the Sunday night news, and then you'll be a backup to the 11 o'clock news. And we hear you know a lot about politics. There's this actor running that we don't think is going anywhere. So I got on the bus with Ronald Reagan right away and got to know him, knew his team, and started doing that. And the story that I love to tell was that by election night, I had done so much that I was on the air from our studios in Burbank back to New York, where they were covering the national scene. And I heard these two guys off to the side step into the studio, and one said, "Hey, kid, how's Reagan doing?" And I said, "He's doing very well. He's going to win." "Kid, are you sure?" I said, "Yes, Mr. Hope and Mr. Crosby. Ronald Reagan's going to win." It was Bing Crosby and Bob Hope.
You were at NBC West, KNBC for 66 to 72, and you covered Reagan's.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about NBC in those days is the local station was run by the network. The local news was, so you had kind of passage, if you will, between the two. I was primarily a local reporter doing politics and then the 11 o'clock news, but I also did a lot of network stuff because the local station, not a good idea, was run out of New York. And they didn't have a feel for Los Angeles, so they made some not very wise moves in terms of who was going to be the anchor until they got people out there who had a feel for the Southern California culture.
So you were both a reporter and an anchor.
Yeah. Yeah, I reported all day, every day, and then I did the 11 o'clock news.
And beyond the Reagan coverage, what other major stories do you recall during that period?
Oh, all of them. I mean, I was in Berkeley. Because we had good air service, I could leave at 8 o'clock in the morning on a local airline, fly to San Francisco, go over to Berkeley, and then get the film out of Oakland back down to Los Angeles. Sometimes I would go with it. and be on the air with it that night. We also had the second Watts. Watts had blown up in '65, blew up again in '66. A man by Melinda Detweiler had been killed by police, and he was rushing his wife to the hospital. A huge story. I remember standing outside the LA courthouse. I was going to be the lead reporter, and a Rolls Royce rolled up. And the most dapper guy you can possibly imagine got out and looked. He said, "Young Mr. Brokaw, I know exactly who you are. I'm Johnny Cochran. We're going to be spending a lot of time together." And I said, "Yes, Mr. Cochran." And that's how I first met Johnny Cochran. Watts was a cauldron. It was boiling all the time, and the LAPD was really hard-nosed, conservative guys, and they saw it as a war. I mean, they took down headquarters down there by using armored vehicles. You know, everything was going at, and at the same time, the counterculture was going on. The flower children were everywhere. The anti-war movements were going on. I was spending time in the valley with, all the Chicanos who were organizing. Doris Huerta, I remember I got to know well. I knew all the people who were doing that. And then NBC was using me more to go out from LA to cover stories in the American West.
And what was going on at Berkeley during that time?
Well, Berkeley was, it was on fire, frankly. Ronald Reagan's first weekend in office, he fired Clark Kerr because Clark Kerr thought he was superior to the president. It was a huge upheaval. And then
he was the head of the university system.
Yeah, and then we had all the things that were going on out on the campus constantly. Stop a minute, I got to remember. The great orator of the student movement.
I know it too.
Oh God, you know who I'm talking about.
I know exactly, and I'm blocking on it.
Yeah,
as well.
he worked in a bookstore, and he was there, and he was a great orator of it. And anyhow, 2:00 in the morning, I'd be in the student union, and I'd hear, all these radicals up there talking, and I thought, where's this going? How's it going to end up? And it really was up for grabs in those days. And then the war between the uniformed police and sheriff's offices and the civilian population was considerable. One of the most memorable times that is still stuck in my mind is that Lyndon Johnson was coming to LA to raise money. And on the west side of Los Angeles, they cleared out a movie studio, and they were building a huge hotel, which he was going to appear at. And there was this big vacant field on the other side, which is now all filled in on the west side of LA. And the West Siders, who were liberal lawyers and doctors and others, showed up to protest Lyndon Johnson, but they were behaving. They were up and down the street yelling, LBJ, go away, LBJ, go away. And the LAPD turned on them. I mean, really turned on them. Drove their motorcycles into them, drove across this parking lot thing that we were. And this was a real wake-up call for the west side of Los Angeles. This is war, politically and otherwise, that we're talking about. Mario Savio. Let me do a Mario Savio thing. Mario Savio was the great philosophical orator of the anti-war movement in Berkeley and the establishment. And I have this vivid memory of being outside of Sproul Hall, which is the big building. And I went over to, I said, "Are you going to speak?" And he typically said, "It's not up to me, it's up to them," turning to the students. And a couple of minutes later, they said, "Mario, Mario, Mario." And he got up, and he looked at the crowd. He's a real intellectual. He was not just a showboat. I mean, the guy knew what he was doing. Looked at the crowd, looked back at Sproul Hall, had a great cameraman, and Mario said, sweeping his hand towards Sproul Hall, "This is not the university." And my cameraman had followed him perfectly. And he turned back and he said, "This is the university." And it was the crowd that he was in. And the place went up. That was the power of television. You didn't need to say anything more. There was no newspaper man or print journalist who could write that moment as effectively as we could demonstrate it. And I was interested in writing. I was doing some writing by then, but I also knew the tools that I had could convey what Reuben Frank used to call the experience of being there. And that was one of the times that I really remember that was perfect. And Savio understood that.
While you were in Los Angeles, I understand that you received a job offer from Washington, not on television, or at least
No.
in the employ of television.
Well, when I was in Los Angeles and covering especially Reagan and the student politics of the university, I met this crew cut guy who was the head of J. Walter Thompson, the advertising agency, and he was the UCLA alumni representative on the Regents, and his name was Bob Haldeman. He introduced himself to me at a Regents meeting, and he was very genial. And he said, I've been watching you. We're doing a big promotion because NBC likes what you're doing, and they're going to do it. And he said, I've got a young man by the name of Ron Ziegler who's overlooking all this. And so I then stayed in touch with him because he was plugged into the Republican Party. And he always knew what was going on. I remember after one night, I came back, was on the air, and he called me the next morning. He said, pretty good, you didn't get it all right. And I said, well, if I come down with a camera crew, he said, yeah, I think there's some things you need to know. Here's what we have in mind, what we're going to do. He now goes off with Nixon in the campaign, and when he would come back to Los Angeles, he was changed. He was harder. He was more difficult to get access to. He would always make room for an interview with me. And but it was, by then he was the Bob Haldeman we later came to know. So about a year and a half into the administration, I get a call from him, and he said, I have a friend in Los Angeles going to take you to lunch tomorrow. I want you to listen. I said, what's this about? He said, go to lunch. So I go to lunch, and the guy says, Bob and the president have talked about this. They want you to be his press secretary. I almost threw up. I mean, I was just reeling. I was not a huge fan of Nixon. I also knew that it was way beyond my ability to go from L.A., drop into Washington, D.C., and represent the president at that podium. I'd get killed. Anybody would have in those days coming. That's what happened to Ron. He wasn't prepared for it. So I went back to the office and I said to my boss, told him what had happened. I said, between us, nobody cannot tell anybody about this. I had just signed a new contract. He called New York. Julian Goodman, who was running NBC in those days, was going down. He said, I'll take care of this. Julian was a fan of mine. And he took Haldeman aside and he said, we understand you made an approach to town. We have big plans for him. I think he wants to stay there. I said, okay. I found out later that Bob didn't give up. He'd call that same guy about once a month and said, go back. And he said, I'm telling you, he's not going to do this. Life goes on. I become White House correspondent during Watergate and all that. And after Watergate, I'm working here, and there was a retrospective on Watergate at Hofstra, and I was waiting to go on. I get this big bear hug from behind me, and a familiar voice says, you know how many times I've watched you on television and thought, I could have sent him to jail, and it was Haldeman. So he did have a sense of humor, at least, about it.
And apparently he liked you a lot, Tom.
Tom, sorry, I think it's 12, you need to go.
Yeah, I'm gonna.